Welcome to the latest episode of Employment Talks, a Lydian podcast aimed at providing listeners practical insights into pressing employment law topics in Belgium. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Employment Talks, a Lydian podcast aimed at providing listeners practical insights into pressing employment law topics in Belgium. Employment Talks is a Lydian podcast. Lydian is a full-service Belgian business law firm with a practical and personalized approach to practicing law. Through a fine blend of transactional law expertise and litigation skills, we deliver straight-to-the-point solutions that add true value. We think client-focused, we act fast, and we speak frankly in a language that you understand. From our offices in Brussels, Antwerp, and Hasselt, our mission is to find solutions through excellent legal insight and strong business instinct. That is how we exceed expectations, deliver consistent results, and forge long-term relationships with industry leaders. Counting 17 lawyers, Lydian's employment, pensions, and benefits team is the largest team you will find in any independent Belgian full-service law firm. We take pride in the size of our team because of the responsiveness it allows us to bring to our clients every day. But even more so, we are proud of the expertise that comes with it. All 17 lawyers, from associate to partner level, advise clients on general employment law topics, from the start until the end of the employment relationship and everything in between, both on an individual and a collective level. Additionally, every lawyer has specific fields of interest, ranging from privacy, health and safety, pensions and benefits, to internal investigations and international employment. My name is Kato Aerts. I'm a partner in the Employment, Pensions and Benefits Department of Lydian, and I'm delighted to be your podcast host. Today, I'm meeting with Alexandra Stoica, associate in our Employment, Pensions and Benefits practice for over 2.5 years and based in our office in Antwerp. Alexandra is dedicated to helping businesses successfully navigate their workplace employment issues and focuses both on individual and collective labor law. Welcome, Alexandra. It's so nice to have you on the podcast today. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you, Kato, for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here and especially to talk about today's topic. So let's dive right in.
Fantastic. The second episode of our podcast is dedicated to International Women's Day. Today, we're talking about the state of the law and how it seeks to accommodate an inclusive workplace free of gender based discrimination. Or is this already the case and has an International Women's Day become unnecessary? Alexandra, could you please enlighten me and explain to our audience?
Well, Kato, before we get into the legal aspect of how legislation is trying to combat discrimination, it's a good idea to take a look at some figures first. Because in the European Union, for instance, the average gender pay gap was still 12.7% back in 2021. That means that women in the EU earn on average 12.7% less per hour than men. Belgium is doing better than that because the average pay gap here was only 5% back in 2021. So Belgium has already made some great improvements since the pay gap here was still 9.4% back in 2011. But of course, the pay gap is still here. Besides the pay gap, we should also be aware of the fact that the glass ceiling is also still present. And by that, I mean the fact that at the top of the hierarchy within companies, there's not yet an equal division between women and men. And both these things are why it remains so important to continue to pay attention to gender equality. And of course, Women's Day is the perfect time for that.
Given the more limited pay gap in Belgium, I assume there is already quite a few legislations in place here.
Well, Kato, yes and no. Belgium has adopted certain legislation that aim to have a positive impact on the pay gap. For instance, companies with at least 50 employees have to conduct a detailed analysis of the remuneration structure within their company. They have to do this every 2 years, and the purpose of such an analysis is to determine whether the company has a gender neutral remuneration policy in place. And if this is not the case, consultations will have to be held with the employee representatives. Moreover, these same companies also have to submit the report of this analysis to the Works Council or union delegation. And on the proposal of one of these bodies, so the Works Council or the union delegation, the employer may have to appoint a staff member as mediator. This mediator then has to provide assistance for the application of measures that are necessary to combat the gender pay gap that is present within the company. Employers have to comply with these rules, and if they do not do so, penalties can be imposed. Besides these rules that apply to the individual companies, we also have some rules that apply at the sectoral level. For instance, joint labor committees that use job classifications have to submit these to the Federal Public Service for Employment, Labor and Social Dialogue, and this service then evaluates whether the job classifications are gender neutral. More generally, Belgium also has extensive anti discrimination legislation in place, and this covers also discrimination on the basis of gender and gender related criteria in the work context. Now, although we have all these rules in place, it's of course still difficult for women to substantiate a discrimination claim. So it would be a little too short sighted to claim now that the rules we just spoke about alone have reduced the gender pay gap. This must be seen in a broader social context, and of course, we still have a way to go.
Of course, but it's still a positive evolution, I would say. So it looks like some work has already been done in Belgium. Will this be reinforced in the future by new European regulations?
Exactly, Kato. And yes, at the European level, gender equality and gender equality at work is a hot topic as well. Under Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission has set out an EU gender equality strategy for the period between 2020 and 2025. Amongst ending gender based violence, one of the other key objectives of this strategy is to close gender pay gaps in the labor market and to achieve equal participation across the different sectors of the economy. In any case, the lack of pay transparency has been identified as one of the major issues that prevent us from closing this EU gender pay gap that we just spoke about. And that is exactly why the EU actually recently took a big step forward by introducing a new directive, being the EU Pay Transparency Directive, and they did this in June 2023. Member states have 3 years to transpose this directive, but I want you to know, Kato, that employers better start preparing themselves right now.
That sounds like there are some big changes coming our way.
Yes, exactly. The directive creates new and extensive information obligations for all employers that operate within the European Union. And in addition, employers that employ more than 100 employees will have to comply with far reaching reporting requirements as well. The rules will apply in both the public and the private sector, and both to listed and non listed companies. So, this is quite a big scope. And if employers were to wait until the directive is fully transposed into national law, frankly, they would be overtaken by events. This is even more the case because the directive impacts all phases of the employment relationship. For instance, the directive imposes a salary transparency requirement at the point of recruitment. So this means that job candidates will have to be informed about the pay rate or pay range for the role they're applying for prior to the job interview. Now, in practice, this means that the information should, for example, be mentioned in the job vacancy that an employer publishes online. So candidates will not have to request this data anymore. And of course, this makes salary negotiations a lot easier and a lot more transparent. In addition, the directive also prohibits employers to ask about the salary history of a candidate. By doing so, the EU legislator actually wishes to ensure that existing pay discrimination and biases are not perpetuated when somebody decides to change jobs. Both these things relate to the transparency before the start of the employment relationship, but as I said, the directive also strengthens the transparency during the course of the employment relationship. So, one of the things that employers will have to do is to make available a statement of the criteria they use to determine the pay levels and pay progression to their employees. Another important change is that workers will have the right in the future to request information on their individual pay level and on the average pay levels within the company, broken down by gender for the categories of employees or workers that are doing the same job as them or that are doing work of equal value. Lastly, and perhaps the most important change for employers that employ at least 100 employees, is the fact that a gender pay gap reporting will be put in place, which means that employers will have to report and publish a detailed set of statistics which break down the gender pay gap within their company. Employees, employee representatives, labor inspectorates, and equality bodies will have the right to ask employers for clarification on these statistics. Moreover, these reports can also trigger additional auditing. If the report shows an average pay gap of at least 5% for workers doing the same work or work of equal value, If the employer has not justified these differences with objective and gender neutral criteria, and if the employer has not remedied the differences within 6 months of submitting the gender pay gap report.
The audit will then have to include measures to address the gender pay gaps, and the employer will have to remedy them. If he does not do so, a court could order an injunction or impose recurring penalty payments.
Now, when will these reports be due? The first annual gender pay gap reports will be due in 2027 for employers with at least 150 employees. Employers with more than 250 employees will have to report yearly, and employers with 150 up to 249 employees will have to report every 3 years. Employers with 100 up to 149 employees will have to report every 3 years, but only as of 2031.
Okay, that's very interesting. So, a lot of changes coming up. What about women on board of listed companies?
Well, recently in 2022, a milestone has been achieved with the directive on gender balance in corporate boards. This directive remained blocked in the Council for over 10 years due to the lack of a favorable qualified majority. However, the Commission and the Parliament always maintained a strong commitment to this file, especially within the framework of the 2020-2025 gender equality strategy, which we just talked about. In January 2022, the Commission President and the French presidency were determined to move forward with this file, and this finally led to the adoption of it. In any case, this directive does not just target any company, but it targets companies that have a particular economic importance, visibility, and impact on the market. So it applies to companies which have their registered office in a member state, are listed on a regulated market in a member state, and enterprises which employ more than 250 employees and have an annual turnover exceeding 50 million or an annual balance sheet exceeding 43 million. Now, what does this directive do? It introduces mandatory quotas to ensure a minimum representation of both genders on the boards of listed companies. So, following this directive, members of the underrepresented sex must either hold at least 40% of non executive director positions or hold at least 33% of all, so executive and non executive director positions. If companies opt for the 40% rule, then this must be accompanied by individual quantitative objectives to improve the gender balance amongst executive directors. Now, in any case, the rules laid down in the directive go hand in hand with reporting obligations and with sanctions.
What will be the impact of this directive in Belgium?
Well, in Belgium, we already have quite extensive rules in place, thanks to the Quota Act. It goes even further than the directive in some respects because it applies to all listed companies regardless of their size. So, Belgian listed companies are already quite familiar with mandatory quotas. At the moment, a minimum of 1/3 of the members of the board of directors must be of different sex in Belgium. If the listed company has, however, opted for a two-tier system, so with a supervisory board and a management board, a minimum of 1/3 of the members of this supervisory board must be of different sex. So at the moment, no quota apply to the management board. In any case, Belgium will have to take additional measures to fully comply with the requirements laid down in this directive. They have until the 28th of December 2024. That's this year, so let's wait and see.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Alexandra. That's all the time we have today. Many thanks for taking the time to record this episode of Employment Talks with me. I enjoyed it a lot, and I hope you did too.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for having me, Kato.
The last words go out to everyone who tuned in for this episode of Employment Talks. I hope the content of this episode was as entertaining and interesting for you as it was for me. If you have any questions in relation to the topic we brought to you today, of course, feel free to reach out to Alexandra or to myself. If you do not have our contact details yet, make sure to visit us at our website www.lydian.be or simply reach out through LinkedIn. This was Employment Talks, a Lydian podcast. If you liked this episode, please make sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts, and feel free to leave a comment or share it with people you think may be interested too. We look forward to hearing from you, and we would love to welcome you again in 2 weeks for our next episode.